بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الصلاة والسلام على خاتم الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وأصحابه والتابعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين وبعد. Indeed, our praises and thanks belong to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the creator, the sustainer, and the controller of all that happens in the universe. And we invoke His peace and blessings upon His noble messenger, his family, his companions, and all those who follow them in righteousness until the end of time. My dear brothers and sisters in Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I know sometimes when we look at what's happening in the world around us, the situation seems quite hopeless. And sometimes it seems as if we will never, as Muslims, be able to shake off the stereotyping and the very negative images that seem to be seared in the memory of most people. But in spite of that, brothers and sisters, there are, mashallah, a lot of good news. In spite of the fact that the early Muslims with the Prophet ﷺ faced tremendous odds, and for many years in Mecca, anyone who was on the outside looking at the situation and what was happening would have thought that there was no way that these Muslims could ever survive and that their religion would become established in the land and a force to be reckoned with. But what we tend to forget from time to time is that the Prophet ﷺ did not manufacture Islam on his own. He did not sit down and one day came up with this brilliant idea to preach a religion called Islam to the people. This is a religion of Allah the Exalted, and He simply used the Prophet ﷺ like He used the other human messengers. May Allah's peace and blessings be upon all of them. He simply used them to convey His message to mankind, to the people. So, in spite of how hopeless it had seemed at that time, the Prophet ﷺ quietly persisted in conveying the message and in living the message that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed to him. And it was not his choice or decision to decide, well, progress seemed to be zero and therefore the mission has failed and we should just pack it in. It was not for him to do that. Because the success or the lack of success thereof of the mission lies not with the individual but with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah has made it clear that His deen will be established in the land. Whether the unbelievers like it or not, doesn't matter. And so whether we're part of the people, group of people whom Allah uses to establish His deen or not, the deen will be established. So just like in those days when things seemed hopeless, it wasn't really hopeless. Maybe for some time, people did not see the results that they were hoping for, but eventually it did triumph. And in a few short years, by the will of Allah the Exalted, of course, Islam became a force to be reckoned with. It became established in the land. And as a result, even after 14 centuries, you and I are here, mashallah, in large numbers. Now, I'm saying all of this because recently, I received an email about the rate of conversions in the UK, in Britain. And we know that in Britain, there is a lot of negativity about Islam and about Muslims and Islamists, as they call them, and fundamentalists and so on in Britain. Perhaps much more than Canada. And people over there seem to be a lot less tolerant and willing, as people in Canada seem to be, in coexisting peacefully with people of other faiths. And what the article describes is this amazing phenomenon of many Britons converting to Islam, becoming Muslims. From all walks of life, young and old, educated, laymen as we say. And according to this article, of course there are no formal statistics to prove the numbers, but nevertheless some polling were done for this article by calling some of the Islamic centers in London. And when the rest of the country was factored in, the poll found that close to 5,000 people a year in Britain, in all of Britain, enter into Islam. And this is amazing, that in spite of all the negative things that are going on in the media about Islam and about Muslims, there are, mashallah, many people who see beyond all these negative images and they recognize the truth for what it is. The article also mentions some short interviews of some of the people who have become Muslims. And there was a young lady who was interviewed. And she said initially what actually attracted her to Islam, or made her take another look at Islam, was the fact that the Muslim friends she had, they never wanted to go out to parties and to clubs. She said she felt affronted that these young people did not want to go clubbing. But it stirred her curiosity. So she began to investigate it more. What religion or what set of beliefs would motivate young people who were born and raised in Britain and exposed to all these social gatherings and social outings? What set of beliefs would cause young people in such an environment, who were born and raised in that environment, to have certain principles or discipline, a certain level of discipline, whereby not only did they not go out to these places, but they did not see themselves as missing out on the fun and enjoyment in life. And as a result, she began to study Islam, and eventually she became Muslim. And so, in spite of all the negative that's happening and going on, we should know, and we should take heart from the fact that all this negative portrayal of Islam and Muslims, perhaps in the long run, does have a positive side. And that is, in as much as some people's minds might be poisoned by all this incorrect misinformation, or is that an oxymoron? Incorrect disinformation? Anyways, all this incorrect information and the misinformation, the deliberate misinformation about Islam and Muslims, that there are still those who become curious enough to seriously read up on Islam and study it, and when they do, they are inevitably attracted to and drawn by the truth that it is. And this is precisely what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to do as human beings, to study the Quran. Because once a person studies the Quran, in some details at least, he or she would realize that this is a different book. They would recognize that this book is strange, at the very least it's strange. But the thing is, brothers and sisters, we have to not let what appears to be hopeless deter us from living the life. Remember, the Prophet ﷺ, he was hoping for a better outcome, of course, to his preachings in Mecca. It did not happen though. But he continued to do what he had to do quietly and peacefully. And so the people themselves who were reluctant, eventually they saw the truth in the message that the Prophet ﷺ brought and came with. And that is precisely the example we need to follow these days. By our own behavior and by our own lives and our interactions with other people, we can actually clear up the picture, clarify the air of the true teachings and values of Islam and the Quran. We don't need to rant and rave about it. We don't need, mashallah, even to buy prime time exposure on television. We get it for free. Yes, salam. We get it for free. But I believe if we follow the Prophet's example, alayhi salatu wassalam, by not losing hope and despairing over what seems to be all these negative images and stereotyping, and it seems like we can't get out of it, not to be bogged down by this or to be deterred by this, but to continue to, at the very least, live and practice Islam ourselves. See, the Prophet ﷺ did not stand on the street corners in Mecca telling off the Meccans and accusing them of fabricating things about him and about the revelation he brought from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They labeled all these false accusations against him, of course, calling him a poet, a madman, a magician, possessed. And the Quran preserves some of these accusations that Quraysh leveled at him. But the Prophet ﷺ did not sort of waste or utilize his energies and his resources in simply refuting these false claims. He turned a blind eye, completely blind eye to these things. He carried on as if these things were never said about him, alayhi salatu wassalam. So he continued to quietly live the message and preach the message and talk to anyone who was willing to listen. That was his life for many years in Mecca. He never once challenged Quraysh to any kind of debate, to deal with the issues, with the accusations they were leveling at him. Never. But he quietly persisted in doing what he was doing, living the message, and then also preaching to the message to anyone who was willing to hear and willing to listen. And that is what I believe we need to start practicing these days. Not to lay blame on anyone outside. We don't need to start saying, the media is like this, and then we start blaming the Jews, they control the media or whatever. That may be so. And if a person doesn't like you, of course that person will go out of his or her way to make you look bad. In fact, that's the reality that the Quran has taught us. So we need not really be surprised per se, or extra surprised, at all these negative images and stereotyping of Islam and Muslims these days. But we need to follow the example of the Prophet ﷺ. He had his fair share, as we say, of these stereotyping and negative images. But subhanAllah, he quietly persisted in living the message and in preaching the message, and eventually, after years, it became established in the land and Islam began to spread. So when I read this article, I said, subhanAllah, in this day and age, especially women who convert to Islam, because quite often it's women issues that people use to spread the negative images about Islam and about Muslims. That women are repressed, that they're suppressed, that they're taken advantage of in Islam, things like that. And yet amazingly, there are women, many women, in the world, not just in Britain, but even in Canada, in America, who become Muslims. And these are women, at least some of them are educated women. Educated women. Because the person might say, oh, an uneducated woman might be misled by the sweet talk of somebody and they become Muslim. But what about those who are educated? In this day and age, in spite of all the negative things they have heard and they've seen and they've read about Islam, in the end they still choose to become Muslim. I remember last year, right here in Toronto, a young lady from Colombia came to do some studies in Toronto. And in the masjid right here, she ended up becoming Muslim. And in Ramadan, she went back to Colombia. 2 Ramadans ago, I remember another young lady from Mexico came here again. She's a lawyer in Mexico. She came to do some studies here, was rooming with some Muslim sisters. And so she began to investigate Islam, and 2 Ramadans ago in Ramadan, the first weekend, I remember, she became Muslim. So subhanAllah, this is the amazing thing, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will establish His deen in the land. That we should have no doubts about. But we should not become frustrated when there are setbacks. We should not become frustrated. We should, as the Prophet did alayhi salam, be patient and continue to live the message. That's important. Continue to live the message and do whatever little we can, because in the end, it's our own behavior, brothers and sisters, that is one of the most important forms of spreading the message of Islam. It is our own behavior, our own lives, our own dealings we have with people. This is the best form, or one of the best forms, of taking the message of Islam to the wider world. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless all of us. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless the brothers and the sisters who are new Muslims, who are reverts. And may He continue to keep their hearts firm on the straight path. May He continue to bless them and to guide them, so that their faith would increase and they would not fall victims to the temptations and the deviations of shaitan. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless all of us. May He inspire us and motivate us to live by this wonderful message and way of life that He has revealed for us. And may He also keep us firm on the straight path and protect us from the deviations of the society in which we live. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.